Awesome.
Okay, the recording has started, and this is the Crossplane v0.3 Retrospective. Steve, you're sharing your screen right now. Are you moderating? Are you driving?
I volunteered, and if you want me to, I will.
Yes, you volunteered, and I would love that as well. Oh, sweet. I see that you responded to that. Thank you, Steve.
Awesome. Okay, well, I will start with a quick review of our SIG services retrospective. Doesn't look like anyone new is here, so you all know the drill. We will go through and celebrate the things that went well and we're proud of. Talk about things to improve and that we can do better, and raise any questions, things that you guys want to discuss. So, is everybody here is familiar with the retro process, so I won't belabor the point. We will spend the first 5 minutes adding cards to this board. Everybody has access to the board. So yeah, so I will set the timer on this, and I'm going to use the TED Talk timer. So I'm going to set it up, and why don't you guys, it looks like it's already got some stuff, so maybe you guys have already gotten your items on it, but why don't we go ahead and start adding some stuff.
Does anyone remember, there's some way to like add your name while you're writing, you like add yourself or something?
Yeah, that's exactly what you do, Nick. And then your name disappears from the card and it just adds you as a member. I don't seem to be I don't seem to be a member showing up though. I don't know.
You might be able to click join board. I just did.
Oh, that's weird. I'm adding cards to the board, but I'm not on the board. Huh. I don't know how that.
I see. You just changed from on 0 to on 1 boards in my dashboard. I think that you probably all have to like join it or something. You all are on the team that this board belongs to.
Yeah, I see the link there, the join board link. Yeah, I had to do that too. Thank you.
Cool. Does anyone remember what the thing that I was about to type up was?
Probably like celebrate how awesome everyone on your team is and how much you depend on them daily and how much you love them. I think that's what it was.
That sounds something that is closer to you on the positivity scale than me, Jared.
Are we okay with sharing the beta signup link with like any potential user at this point for Upbound Cloud?
No, I think it's still yeah, I think so, because you can just add yourself to a wait list and like we have to explicitly like approve you before you can get access to it. So I think so.
Yeah.
Because it's on the upbound.io, I think, that same wait list thing.
my bad. Apparently I didn't actually start the timer. So we'll just go another couple minutes. How are people feeling?
Yeah, I think like at least 2 minutes or so, Steve, would be great.
Okay. So are we trying to keep this separate from Stacks retrospective as well, or?
Yeah, well, to be clear, the scope of this is everything Crossplane 0.3, so services and stacks.
Okay. Give it another minute. Is everybody done adding things?
Yeah, I think so.
Thumbs up if you're done.
Yes, I'm close enough.
Cool. All right. We will go through and add some context here if you feel like you need to explain some of these. And don't think for the celebrations, we don't typically add context, right? So
I think it's nice to add context for the celebrations, but then we don't sort of, then we get rid of them after that.
I see. All right, Nick, ship to thing.
Yeah, which is self-explanatory, but you know, the context for those of us who haven't been around since the start of the year, like this is only the third release that we shipped, and it was a really long time between 0.2 and 0.3, and it felt before all of you new people on Crossplane, which I guess is everyone who isn't Jared or I. Just before you started, it felt like we were like losing direction, and there was some fear that we were just kind of spinning. So like actually shipping 0.3 and having direction again felt really good.
Great. Let's see here. First Stacks release, develop and focus docs and tools.
Yeah, I guess similar to what Nick was saying, Stacks was just this word that seemed to pop out of nowhere, and now it's a thing, and it's even had a few evolutions along the way, and it's before it was like it's such a nebulous idea. Well, what is a stack? It's kind of a little bit of everything. We've kind of got some ideas what it is and what it isn't now, and we may change that again, but it's nice that it's not just this made up word and concept with nothing behind it.
Incredibly cool to see it materialize. Awesome. Jared, regressions from v0.3 were fairly few.
Yeah, I feel like even though we don't have, integration testing for all the different services and scenarios, et cetera, we support, I think we did a good job of going through the guides and doing manual testing and vetting such that I believe the quality level or the amount of known bugs, there are bugs found in the releases that made it out there is really not that high. So I was pretty happy with the quality of the release.
Great.
Take a long time to ship code, but we ship perfect code.
Just from the outside perspective, it's just been incredible to see you guys all gel together, and so many new folks come together and jump right in and contribute to the release. And it's definitely pushed the maturity of Crossplane. I'm really excited about the future. Nick, a slight uptick in Slack engagement.
Yeah, I don't know if this is just my imagination or not, but engagement from the community is very top of mind at the moment, and leading up to and just after 0.3, it kind of felt like I was seeing every now and again a few more people on Slack who weren't members of our team. I'm not sure if that's just organic or due to all the community engagement that people like Dan and Marcus will be doing, but it's good.
Awesome. We have a video stream. Dan?
So this, I thought it was pretty cool that Dan had an idea for doing a video series. And then I was like, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. And then other people said, yeah, do it. And then he did. And it seems like it's pretty cool and it's going pretty well.
That's awesome. Have we gotten folks from outside of the company joining? I didn't get to attend this morning.
Yeah, it looked like we had about 20 or so people on this morning. So that was good. Definitely some people outside Upbound. And then you'll see people join. It seems like the last couple episodes we've tried to make it necessary to join the TBS channel to follow along. So you'll see people join in Slack, which is cool. Also, shout out to Daniel he made the song, the bumper music on there, which is pretty sweet that we have even the music is Crossplane.
Sweet.
Yay.
We should also have his song played there sometime.
The other one, the rap song.
Cool. Mavafik says we're much closer to capture mainstream app scenarios end-to-end, completely deployed via Crossplane.
Yeah, especially the connectivity stuff that we implemented, for all providers. I think that's a killer feature, I believe, for Crossplane. We're much closer to still apply WordPress and have everything up and running. So that's pretty good.
Is there a dream scenario within reach for you?
What?
Is there a dream scenario that is within reach for you?
Yeah. Actually, so there was the SAP Data Hub project that I was working at SAP. So, with each release, I think I think if we could have used Crossplay for this now, each day we're getting closer to that.
Cool. All right. Feels like we're making big thing together.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very excited, this whole Crossplane thing, and then seeing all you guys working so hard, and then having this sense of strong team and community, and then believing in what you're doing. That's awesome, and I'm really glad that I'm part of it. I'm having this feeling that this is going to be something great.
And feeling good about our team dynamic.
Yes. I was thinking about how the majority of us joined within the last 3 months, and we already feel, at least for me, like a pretty comfortable team that works well together and is doing a lot of stuff. And I thought that was pretty awesome.
Cool.
Yeah, there was this one guy named Suskin who keeps raising bugs all the time. Kind of harshes my buzz on the team dynamic front. Just kidding.
Great. I think everybody got a shout out in there, a celebration. Let's go on to potential improvements. Have someone who is not Jared manage the 0.3 release. Nick?
Yeah, definitely not a comment on Jared's great job of managing these releases, more just an observation that I think Jared is the only one who knows how to do it at the moment. So if Jared was hit by a surfboard or something, then we need someone else to learn that pretty quickly. So it'd be maybe for like 0.4, someone else should shadow or something like that and learn the tricks of the trade until we get to automating it.
So this is more about the mechanics of actually pushing out the release?
Yeah, well, to take a step back, I would have, like, if you were like, hey, Nick, go release 0.3.1, I would have no idea where to start. Like, I don't know what to do there. So just for fairness, to make sure that, Jared doesn't get stuck with doing it every time, because I think that, we were all up late a lot of those days, but as far as I could tell, Jared didn't go to bed at all and was up until most of the next day doing the release as well. So for fairness, it would be good, and just for redundancy and knowledge sharing, I think it would also be good to spread that work around.
I'm pretty sure Jared was wearing the same shirt the whole week before the release.
I do that on non-release weeks too, so
Still
Just
wearing the
crossplane.
shirt now.
this is yesterday's shirt.
Okay. Nick, a much smaller feature and PR diff between 0.3 and 0.4.
Yeah, or maybe, I said this a while ago, but something that maybe resonates a little bit better now is doing point releases. Something that we've been talking about a lot in planning is, Crossplane changed a ton between 0.2 and 0.3. We didn't have default resource classes. We didn't have non-portable claims. 0.2, for context, was basically we had just added Redis support, and we hadn't even started working really on the GitLab stuff or anything like that. We added stacks, like, it was huge. So I do think there should be probably less stuff between 0.3 and 0.4, but also there's one thing that's sort of top of mind. Side note, I feel like I keep saying top of mind the last few days. It annoys me. One thing that's on my mind is, given that we always have very ambitious goals between releases, we always want to do a lot and feel we need to do a lot for our business. Is it better to do like 8 things across 8 weeks between 0.3 and 0.4, or should we do 2 things for 2 weeks and then 2 things for 2 weeks and then yada yada? Whether we could break this down into more manageable releases.
Great. Sounds like further discussion is warranted there.
It does. Can I provide a quick suggestion to the group here? That when we're providing context here, I would like to be able to go a little bit faster with that. Perhaps we have 30. We have almost 30 cards on here. If we spend just 1 minute on each, then it'll be almost noon before we even get to start having real discussions. So if if it's kind of self-explanatory from the title, then I would hope to be able to move a little bit quicker if possible.
Okay.
And one thing we experimented with to do that in the Stacks retro was we said, if anyone needs more context on this, do a thumbs up or raise your hand or something.
Okay. So we'll move to that. I will read it out, and if you give me the thumbs up, you can give more context. Implement a formal code freeze approximately 1 week or however long we want before the 0.4 release. Only cherry pick onto release branch after freeze.
Question: what is the benefit, the goal for the benefit to capture?
It would just be, so that's kind of like from the Kubernetes model a little bit, how they do releases. I think they actually do longer than 1 week, but basically it's just that, we aren't trying to fit any functionality in 2 days before and then having to correct bugs that come up with that. It's we're only correcting bugs of stuff that already exists. So that's pretty much the rationale.
Cool.
Okay. Release team, we don't want to have to stay up all night, but if something comes up, and it probably will, it would be nice to have some on-call people who are saying ahead of time they will be available. More refined documentation with some notes there. End-to-end testing of examples should be part of integration tests.
And on the more refined documentation note there, Javad, that looked like some really thorough notes in there. So we could potentially consider opening issues to track that as well, because that looks like that might be some useful content that I don't want to go in between the cracks.
Yeah, I was hoping Phil was here too. Yeah, we could talk about those. I briefly talked to Suskin about those comments, but yeah.
Stack should have integration tests. Introduce semantic versioning and keep a change log with user, feature, and breaking change indicators.
Is this
The last go ahead.
question? Is this keeping a changelog for all projects or specifically Crossplane?
Each stack should have its own.
Okay.
Okay.
The CLI for that matter too.
The last couple of weeks of the release felt very crammed with integration testing and documenting.
And I guess the improvement would be do them earlier.
Mm-hmm. Smaller and more frequent releases. Let's see. Less manual release process seems like it could be helpful. Come up with a list of questions that if all can be answered yes by the diff between the latest release and now, we will release a new version. It feels as though we could emphasize integrating first to avoid an integration scramble late in the release. More cross-plane CLI features, cloud secret provider configuring, filling in the steps between Cube Builder and cross-plane runtime, templated stacks, the future, and documentation process. And so that is the potential improvements. For questions, how do we maintain work-life balance, aka work until the release, early hours leading up to a release? Not working
until the early hours.
Not working. How do we keep users aware of upcoming changes and compatibilities and design to implementation drifts? Do people find ZenHub Sprint Kanban board to be useful? How do we build in a space to reflect on a release, capture learnings, improve process, and close out straggling issues before starting on the next release? What could we have done differently to have seen a bigger uptick in metrics like new issues and PRs from the community? Do we feel our priorities for 0.3 were reasonable in retrospect? Should we formally estimate and measure the issues that we commit to in a milestone? Should we release every single sprint? How do we want to load balance community engagement? How do we feel about the speed and turnaround time for code reviews and design reviews? What is crucial? What is the crucial scenario we want to show off going forward? And it feels like ownership of workloads fell through the gaps for 0.3 at first. Who owns it? Should we be more actively promoting Crossplane and engaging with other community forums and influencers? And planning feels a bit rushed. What could we do here? Okay, so we're going to spend some time, I believe, going through and grouping these topics. Let's see. So,
Steve, is your window sort of narrow? Like
how's
it
that?
is. That's getting wider.
I'm widening it. Do you see everything in
The comments on the doc are cut off just a little bit on the right side.
I didn't think we needed to see those. Okay, there we
Yeah,
go.
because the Trello board is specifically, like the doc isn't that important to see, but the Trello board gets a whole bunch of columns when you start grouping stuff, so like it needs width
Yes.
there.
Let's expand that. Okay, so what's the process for grouping here? We want to
Folks is just jumping on in there now. Can't stop these boys. Steve.
How do we go through the grouping process?
It's usually kind of, well, in my experience, I don't know if you've been doing something different in Stack side of the world, it's sort of group sourced, crowdsourced. We just sort of, everyone puts things in columns that make sense, and then we talk about it.
Okay.
But we
So I
should
set the timer for 5 minutes. Why don't we go ahead and start grouping?
just to add some context, I added a column that I initially called release process, and I've now changed it to last mile release process, because arguably the entire release is the release process. So we're in the release process for 0.4 now. But what I was kind of thinking was more like literally the last like sprint leading up to the release or so.
Should we call it releasing?
So doesn't the Zen Hub stuff feel more like the tools than the last mile of the release?
The reason that I put it, I dragged it in here and I was on the fence. The reason I put it here was because that's when I felt it the most. We had a couple of times when it was like there was a lot on the board and I found myself like writing a Google Doc. So it could go onto tools as well, but that was the context in which I felt it the most. And I feel it less now that we're sort of back at the start of a sprint or start of a release.
Because there's some other things here that feel like tools and process.
Hmm.
Like this less manual release process.
Yeah, I could see that that case somehow.
Maybe we can group the tools and process.
Sure. I'll add a column for it.
Okay.
Well, maybe I'll make it like I guess maybe I'll make it tools specifically, because there's a lot of stuff in this process.
Okay. Are folks still organizing?
We've got nothing left in the original columns, which is good. So now is just making sure we're good with these topics that we have.
Sometimes it feels like if we have too many things in one column, that it might be too big of a topic. I don't know how you guys feel about that. And I just know that planning is always a loaded one, right? That
Yeah, Steve, I think that would be cool if we could come up with like a subcategory from that. That would be really neat.
How do we feel we could break this into something a little bit more discreet? Let's see. Planning feels rushed. So there's
my question around like what's the crucial or critical scenario we want to show off, that might be related to adoption and engagement. Like, because my intent there is, what do we want to show off that's going to excite people and get people into the project is really what I mean.
Yeah, I just dragged that over.
Cool.
I agree.
It also seems like
moved the manual release process into the tools column.
it also seems like we might could do a like planning for 0.4 and just releases in general, because some of these are like specifically about 0.4 and some of them are more about just like how we do releases.
Right.
Yeah,
I was going to say the
release process. Yeah.
It sounds like Jared, what you just mentioned is about the outcomes that we want for Crossplane in terms of engagement and traction, versus the mechanics of actually planning our next release.
Yeah, I think I'm also, I don't know, this is a half-baked thought, but like one thing we should be conscious of how much we're looking back at what we learned from 0.3 versus how much we're just broadly speculating separate from 0.3 about 0.4, if that makes sense. Obviously, what we did in 0.3, we look at it to inform 0.4, so it's in context to think about what we do and make improvements. But let's make sure we look back at 0.3 as well as just thinking about 0.4.
Okay. All right. Do we? This looks fairly well balanced. Should we reclaim the time and start voting?
Yep, I think so. I'm gonna get a coffee How many votes do we want to have each? We've got a lot of columns this time. Maybe 2 or 3 votes. And do we want to add voting cards? That's how I did it most recently, but I don't know if you Stacks folks have found a better way to do this.
Yeah, that's how we did it. Is vote for this list at the top. I'll start adding some to some. We can
Thanks.
maybe split it up.
Okay. So proposed 3 votes seems reasonable. Let's go ahead and reset the clock here. Go ahead and begin the voting. Go get your coffee.
Vote first.
How do you vote again? Or are we just like adding as
So
well?
you are placing yourself on top of the columns. You have 3 votes. And the
Oh, we have 3
process-
votes this time, not 2, 3.
3 votes, yes.
Ooh, okay.
I think just because of the number of columns. So,
Cool.
and that's,
Out of the way.
how do you
Kat.
do that? You go ahead and you say,
And so you add yourself as a member to the little vote for me voting list for this list card at the top. So you have to click on the card itself.
I
You're
see,
on the,
okay.
Yeah, on the card itself, and then
Vote for
you do
me.
members.
and then you add yourself like this.
I think you do click on the add to card members on the right side there.
Okay,
Yeah.
add to cart
Okay,
members. Got it. Nobody wants to talk about planning, huh?
Okay, I'll vote for Connie.
It's a pity vote.
Should we do like a thumbs up for everyone who's finished voting or something?
Yeah, let's see. Raise of thumbs. Looks like Suskin. Oh, everybody is ready. Okay, great. We are going to now arrange the columns according to votes, right? So it looks like, oh, they're moving on me.
Sorry, I'm a backseat.
Magic.
You've got a self-organizing board.
Trello really has been burning the midnight oil to put in cool features like that.
All right. Looks like we've got adoption and engagement at the top of the list, and then last mile release process second up. So I believe now we're
faster
going
release cadence is tied though with last mile release process.
we're going to give 10 minutes on each of these. We now have 20 minutes remaining. So unless anyone feels strongly otherwise, that means we will only be talking about these 2.
I think we have 50 minutes remaining.
Oh, do we? Okay, great. So
Yeah, it's a 90-minute session, Steve, because
awesome.
it takes 40 minutes to get the board organized before you even start talking.
Okay.
Steve,
Great.
will you also make us an actions column so that you can we can make sure to jump on any that come up during conversation?
Okay. Let's put this over to the left just to keep it in view. All right. I am going to set the clock on, oops, actually, 10 minutes instead. And we are now going to discuss adoption and engagement.
I have a question for this one that relates to my own laziness. I don't go to most of the community engagement events because they are very early in the morning. But to clarify, it sounds like people should, like we already established, people show up to the binding status, people come to the community meeting, right? Like we see engagement at those levels.
Yeah, like for the community meeting, at least, it's normally like 2 to 3 people that are not upbounders, so it's not significant at all. But also, community meetings are traditionally not venues that you get a lot of user adoption at. It's really only core contributors that show up there. So in the Rook project, like we'll normally have between like 12 and 15 people show up to the community meetings, but we have thousands and millions of downloads, thousands of users. So that's not always a great, doesn't always tell you how big the community as a whole is. I'll say that.
Yeah. So the one thing that I've been thinking about a little bit is I hear, the folks on the business side of things are talking to a lot of partners, and it sounds like there's traction and engagement there. We talk to people at conferences. People come and watch the binding status, but if you look at the actual metrics of people raising GitHub issues and people on Slack engaging with us, people raising pull requests, that's pretty slow. So I'm wondering if there's a reason that those specific metrics like GitHub interactions are lower than I would expect.
I wonder if maybe I wouldn't say we're production ready, and I know we're moving towards that, but I feel like that we are very aggressive about saying this is not production ready, which I think is important for, because we don't want people to start running it and run into a bug and then be like, what the heck? But at the same time, I feel like, I feel like people, the first thing they hear is like, oh, this isn't ready to go. And so I wonder if we could be a little more tactful about how we say, this is still in alpha, but like you can run it and it will do things and it should work as expected, kind of. I'm not really sure. That's a tough balance, but I've kind of noticed that a little bit.
That's true, actually. I mean, there's a lot to be said about this, but I'm pretty sure our README still says that we're like a tech preview or something like that, right? Like not even just alpha, like somewhere halfway down the README on Crossplane. Checking now.
One other thing I would add, I think it has a lot of impact on the adaptation and engagement, is how well written our documentation and how simple our documentations are. And then if you always have examples running that people could, I'm guessing maybe some people just start to try to kind of like go through one of our examples and it didn't for whatever reason work, and they just like got whatever, it doesn't work. And if you have like more simple and like well-defined and then really working examples, that probably potentially engage more people in our product.
Yeah, my hypothesis is that there's a deeper question, which is on the spectrum of we are making a piece of technology because it is cool, and that is enough justification for us. And the other side being we are filling a need and it doesn't matter how good the code is at all. I definitely feel as though we're closer to we are making a cool piece of technology end of the spectrum in terms of mindset. So I think the question is, do we want to, is there anything we could do to think about keeping the user in mind, such as having that easy to use documentation and very debuggable issues and that type of thing?
I'm not sure that I mostly agreed with what you just said, but then it kind of seemed to pivot towards posing it as you can have quality code or you can care about the user. And I don't think that those are at odds necessarily.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to say that they were at odds. I'm just saying that the extremes they could be at odds. But I guess I'll restate. I feel that we could do even better at keeping the user in mind. And my hypothesis would be that if we were thinking about that a lot, then it might help with getting more adoption and engagement.
One thing that is different in a positive sense to that is that, well, one of the reasons we're chasing user engagement so much is because thinking about the user so far has largely been us as potential users of this software speculating about what users want. And we want to stop speculating and start actually asking real users. Obviously, that means we need to have them. But I will say that since 0.2, as a company or as a team on Crossplane, we have gotten a lot better at that. A lot more like it is what people actually want.
One other thing I was going to add was a lot of our documentation has this sense of knowing what Crossplane is and understanding it, like what the core concepts are, even though we're kind of like referencing this is a terminology and everything, but because it's been written mostly by us, it's kind of like a lot of concepts are already kind of like assumed. And then I'm guessing if someone comes to the website and tries to read the documents, a lot of them probably doesn't make a lot of sense because it's not some outsider writing these docs and then understanding them. Kind of relate to what you just said, Nick.
I think that, I'm not sure if this was under this topic, but one, it could be that many of the flaws with our documentation is a symptom of the fact that it was basically rewritten during all-nighters in the last week of the release. I wonder if we also address that fact that we could have been writing more documentation all along. Then perhaps that end of the release could have been looking at that documentation and reviewing it and being like, in context, like focus on whether this is sensible for the user.
Yeah, Nick, and I think, I think building on that point there, I think that's definitely an action item here. Is that currently we have a pull request template that when you open a pull request, it's like a series of checkboxes there of did you add documentation, did you do this, blah blah blah. We're not using that at all. It's a set of really useful things, and we need to be more critical about things getting accepted into master when they actually have documentation and they actually are, fleshed out to that list of the definition of done being pretty complete and being thorough about having that as a criteria for accepting into master.
I think that another part of this is that we, without fail, are very ambitious with what we want to do in any particular frame of time. And I think as engineers, it's like, okay, if you want to add these 20 features, and you can only barely get them all done, we tend to choose, let's do the 20 features without documentation instead of let's do 16 of those features with documentation.
What do we think of the idea of, as part of planning, having a guideline for the amount of time we want to be spending as a team for thinking about documentation and usability and that type of thing?
I'm not sure if this is exactly what you were thinking, but I think it would make sense to maybe, when estimating things, make sure that we estimate 10% or something like that on top of it for actually like making sure the examples are updated, making sure the documentation makes sense, etc. I think there will still be some time at the end, because if we just go and document every feature and patch the documentation as we go, it runs the risk that when we get to the release, it's all kind of disjointed and doesn't make sense.
I feel like we're getting into a documentation topic, though.
Yeah.
So yeah, good point, Javad. And so something that I wanted to talk about for adoption and engagement still on this topic is that, Nick and I talked about this yesterday, so he's not surprised. But something that I think that we're missing the mark on is that we're not demonstrating how Crossplane can be actually useful to real people, or we haven't built something that's useful to real people yet. And so I was thinking yesterday that it would be a very worthwhile investment to start a dog fooding effort around, like, not for Upbound Cloud, but for some hosting some software such that we have, let's say we have a repository and it's using a GitOps workflow that, you push a commit to it, your infrastructure is declaratively defined there. When you push a commit to it to update that, a GitOps workflow runs with some pipeline, CI/CD pipeline, and it uses Crossplane to take that declaratively defined infrastructure in that repo and put it out into the real world. So you have Crossplane and the GitOps workflow actually managing real infrastructure. That doesn't necessarily have to really be used for something. Maybe it could be Mattermost. Maybe it could be a WordPress blog that we're running and actually putting posts on. Like, it doesn't have to be critical software, but the very act of dogfooding Crossplane in a real world scenario will find bugs, it'll find gaps, it'll find all these things that are preventing Crossplane from actually being useful. and then that doesn't have a direct impact on attracting users to us, but it makes it so that it would be useful for people to actually have, and be happy with in solving problems for them. So I think that dogfooding effort would be significant.
Jared, are you proposing that as sort of a crucial scenario?
Potentially. It's
Because
it's definitely something that I want to accomplish.
I think there's a potential to kill two birds with one stone there by looking at that holistically with our ideas around integration testing and examples. I have I don't disagree, but as we talked about a bit yesterday, I don't feel like something's deploying WordPress that you don't use isn't really dog fooding to I would feel much better about this if we could point to Upbound Cloud is deployed to it, rather than we as a team take some time off and make sure every now and again that it's deployed Mattermost and then go back about our day sort of thing. That feels kind of more like integration testing than real.
Yeah, I hear you on that, Nick, about the usefulness of it is kind of important. But I don't see it, by the way, as every now and then does it deploy that. It's a true GitOps workflow in the sense that it's a live running instance out there in the real world that continues running. It doesn't get torn down. It continues running, and it's backed by the declarative configuration that's checked into a repo.
Yeah, I think my point was that it would be running something that we don't use potentially.
Yeah,
so
that's fair.
It'd be better if it was running something that we actually would care about. And
Yeah.
if it was crap, we can't operate as a business when this isn't there, then that would be ideal.
Yeah, I hear you on that one. Yeah.
I agree with both of those points. And my follow-up question is, so what is the action item to make sure that we actually get that into our planning process?
I think that, we want to add that to our planning document, or, have that as when we do our next planning session, that it is we open an epic on it, or, next step for planning. Just the same as any other items that we're tracking that we don't have opened yet.
Okay.
I think I don't know, to set some context there as well, maybe you already said this, Jared, but one thing that I struggled with here was that, obviously us dog food around thing is kind of it's a proxy for engagement, right? It's a simulator of engagement. It means that we're engaging, but I think the point that Jared made yesterday is that is worthwhile and could move the needle on engagement, because it means that when people do try to engage, they are likely to have a better experience because we've already tried it out a little bit.
Yep. And it's an awesome example to point at too, of hey, look at this real dog food thing. People are oh, that's how you do it. Okay, cool. I could do that too. And it removes a barrier to entry for them to take that step on their own.
I agree with that hypothesis as well. I also like that if we're doing that, we can say things like, we are running this in production ourselves, and this is a battle-tested control plane, not a tech preview control plane.
We're running it for our production WordPress instance. Sorry.
The Automatic use that company Automatic, a $3 billion company. They use WordPress to track all of their team, conversations and stuff. So
maybe we should talk to them.
It would be awesome to keep in scope. Definitely, if this is going to be something that we can go be hey, users, look at this. Then, yeah, looking at places where our just example YAMLs that rot all the time, if we could replace them with part of this dog food process where we don't have that, and that would be ideal.
I'm pumped on this dog food.
Do you want to briefly switch topics within this to what you could have done differently to engage the community and get a bigger uptick?
Yeah, I wrote this question, and the context was kind of just, I don't have any suggestions, but I just wonder if anyone else is oh, duh, if only we had done X, we could have had a much bigger impact on the community or had seen much more engagement.
I personally feel like this direction towards Katacoda training and lowering the bar to just running and interacting with Crossplane in a low stakes way is a way to engage people and get them to, kick the tires and potentially move towards contributions. So I'm kind of excited about that direction and improving it.
Yeah. One ideas that was having, I think I brought it up before, was So we have a streaming video right now, which is cool. But like, if you could have like a short videos of maybe less than 5 minutes or so, which kind of like shows one of the cool features of Crossplane or how easy it is to install and stack and then be ready to go. I think that would probably be effective for people from the community. Just kind of look at that and see how it is. I think that's one of the things I'm thinking that would be effective.
Yeah, so building on what Javad was saying, I think it would also be helpful to, I'm pretty sure we talked about this at some point, but either define or reiterate the ways that we expect people to discover Crossplane and want to try it out. And also the types of early adopters that we are imagining, just to make sure that we are catering to their needs properly.
Yeah, those two are super interesting to me. And the second one is something like I was sort of grumbling about this, I think, with Javad yesterday. I have this is from my own perspective, having run software like this before. I perceive the kind of cloud native, hip, alpha level software as something that small, agile startups want and are more likely to play with. Yet I perceive the multi-cloud value to be something that big, large corporations who actually are mature enough to have multiple clouds are more likely to want. And I wonder if there's this interesting dynamic here where our users are more conservative than the average cloud. Our potential user base is potentially more conservative than the average cloud native software user base.
Yeah.
It's purely a speculation, not something that I know.
More of an observation.
I wonder about that also, which I think is why it would be helpful for us to like write down what we're imagining there so that we can visualize it better and have those discussions in more detail.
I really want to talk about Jared's thing that you wrote about actively promoting Crossplane, but I see that there's 44 seconds left, so I'm having anxiety. Do we want to do a
so thumbs up if you want to extend another 5 minutes on this topic?
Yes, just make the ticking stop.
Should okay, just make it. Should we give ourselves? Do you want another 2 or 5 minutes?
5.
Okay. All right, go ahead.
Well, Jared, did you want to sort of? So when I think about this, I think about basically like going to meetups and like just aggressively preaching Crossplane. Is that kind of what you were thinking, or was it?
Yeah, I think a bit more, maybe more of a digital approach. Like I think Marcus probably has a good example of this, where he's plugged into a whole bunch of different Slack workspaces. There's other like Reddit or Hacker News or Twitter, like being more active in those digital connection forum community sort of things, where if the conversation is on that topic, it's like there's a fine line, or not a fine line, there's an obvious line between spamming stuff like, hey, crossplane, versus like, oh, the topic is on this, you have this problem that you want solved, hey, this project that I work on could solve this for you, have you checked out Crossplane? And just being more active in that sort of thing and getting the word out there, more grassroots, word of mouth. I think Marcus does a good job of that, actually. Marcus, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So this, for that point and maybe the previous 2 points, I think that the whole CI/CD pipeline stuff, that's a good use case, that because everybody's building it, it doesn't need to be production ready. It just needs to build something and throw it away. But again, maybe we're thinking too narrowly about what Crossplane is and can do, because we have these 3 clouds. Like every day I go home and the first thing I think about is how I'm going to use my GCP service, my AWS service. Like I think for that sort of developer mindset, it has to be more useful than just those things. And I think that now that we have stacks and we can start making various kinds of stacks, it'll be more useful of a promotional tool, that it's not just about these 3 big clouds. Like I really wanted to do one with the pizza delivery thing. Like we can make the Domino's delivery stack, and then that's just something that's, sort of funny, but maybe there's a GitHub stack and that one's a lot more useful. Maybe it does. I don't know what exactly it would do, where it lives in your stack, your non-Crossplane stack, but making the tool more accessible for regular conversational development type purposes.
On top of what Marcus and Jared said, I think I mentioned to Jared before, one of the ways that we could engage more would be to just like find related projects, like for example, CI/CD projects on GitHub, which do actually have similar scenarios like WordPress, that we can actually provide a solution for how they are deployed. One of them, for example, I've had interaction with my previous job was Concourse CI/CD. I just pasted there. Their model definitely looks like WordPress. They use a RDS instance and then like Kubernetes. We can just like go there and then, introduce Crossplane and say, this is, we can just create a stack for you if you want. And then because they have a lot of followers, that will become like directly introducing Crossplane there, and then people could just like follow up.
Any other thoughts on that? Okay.
One last thought, that's the same point, is that if we're actually finding useful ways to use it ourselves, then we can blog about it and talk about it in our own voice, not in our shared cross-plane centric developers voice, which like Javad was saying before, maybe we're too insular and our nomenclature is too high of a entry level. If we're just finding ways to use it, and hopefully that's what we're hoping that the community would do, is find reasons to use Crossplane and then talk about it in their own voice that maybe explains things better than what we do now. So it kind of can help the documentation problem and the adoption problem, and also surface new and interesting ways to use Crossplane.
So I'm not sure how many of us, one thing that makes me think of is I'm not sure how many of us have sort of done sort of more DevOps roles in the past as opposed to sort of more pure software engineer leading roles. But one thing that I try to do is think about similar pieces of software at early stages, open source, that I have used in the past. And when I have found it acceptable to take the tolerance of like betting on a new and upcoming project, and how I discovered those things and why I tolerated them when they were alpha. I know for me, two of the big ones were Istio and Linkerd. Linkerd was forced upon me by our colleagues at OfferUp, which Daniel can speak about. So that was part of it. Linkerd took a strategy of just being like, yeah, we're production ready. And it would like serve you null pointer exceptions, like left, right, and center. We tried to deploy it to manage our ingresses at Planet Labs, and it would delete all the ingresses if you deleted one. But they were just like, yeah, we're ready for production. And that was part of their strategy, was just being very confident about something that they shouldn't have been confident about. Istio, on the other hand, said that they were alpha for a long time, but they were at every freaking Kubernetes meetup ever. There was like an Istio talk. Matt Klein was up on stage being like, Istio, 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 and like talking about all these great features it had. And then I tried to use it and half of them didn't work anyway, but I'd already invested time in learning it and trying it and things like that. So I'm usually the first one to grumble when people from Crossplane are up talking about how we have like dynamic scheduling when we really just have like a round robin scheduler or whatever. But I always keep coming back to like, do we need someone full time? Because I know Jared and Ilya and Bassam do a great job in their sort of spare time, and Marcus and Dan of like promoting, but like, would it be useful for someone's entire job to just be like preaching Crossplane and doing all of this, like going to talks, going to conferences, sitting on Hacker News?
Yeah, Nick, we were talking about that in an interview brief that just recently, about that there probably is at this point a strong case for a developer, an advocate, evangelist type of position. They could do like writing the blog posts and going to meetups and be having a strong online presence and making sure that the guides and experience are awesome too, like strong communication abilities, presence, all that stuff. So I think that's a good thing we should probably be following up on now.
Sorry, I got a package like as soon as you started talking there.
While we're on this topic, I will be hitting you all up on Slack about speakers for October 8th Seattle Kubernetes meetup. And I think obviously it's great to hear each individual developer's sort of passion project right now around stacks and things that they're building. and I'm checking to see whether they would like remote speakers. But I think, to the extent that those are localized projects that sort of show how we're using this in real world scenarios, I think they're more engaging than the WordPress scenario. Okay, so we are in overtime again for this topic. I am going to suggest we move on to the last mile release process. Any objections, or do you want to extend the time on adoption and engagement?
Yeah, I would love to move on to the next topic of the last mile release stuff.
Cool. Setting to 10 minutes, and go ahead. Let's talk last mile release.
Actually, I think like the easiest solution is have a document like step by step. That's how we do releases. Like as the first step, like before automating, maybe that would be pretty useful.
Yeah, Moafik, I think that's totally sane, of like a release process document, and like capturing that and having that laid out so it's what's the word, repeatable.
I've been subtly building an AI model of Jared during all our meetings, and I'm planning to train that to do releases.
Okay, so what else? What about having more formal on-call? Or
I think the thing that I want to address the most, because it has the most impact on quality of life, like morale, like engagement, all that sort of stuff, is the staying up late thing. I think we should tackle that head on in this conversation here, because that's probably the biggest topic that affects us here. So one of the things that I'm curious about is, when we released on a Wednesday, started the release on a Wednesday morning, and we had folks that were doing documentation and stuff all night on Tuesday night, essentially. What could we have done to avoid that? Could we have made some, like, in the short term, or in like at that time period, when things, in the past had already happened to get us that situation, should we have made some harder calls of like, okay, we don't need this much content in this guide here, like let's cut this stuff now so we don't have to stay up all night? Or, what are the things we could have done before that to avoid getting to that scenario?
I have some suggestions. I think one of the things I noticed at the time was like why we kind of like, so the reason why we started writing documentations towards the end of the release didn't have any logical reason. I thought it's just like we thought of like changing it. One thing we could do is like have documentation early on. One particular thing hard about documentation for me is like it's for me it's a little bit harder to write documents, because you just have to check, you have to think, you have to rephrase, and then that's take a long time. So I guess not necessarily pushing documentation towards the end of the release. One definitely improvement that we can do for next months.
I think the code freeze idea kind of helps with that a little bit as well, right? Because there's not like, the thing that sticks out to me is that the like portable resource classes came in pretty late, and that affected everything else. And so if we had been like, we're in feature freeze, like we can't really add that right now, then, that arguably might have not have been a good thing in this situation. We might have had to like kind of like break glass on that one. But yeah, I think that in general, if things aren't changing under our feet, that it makes the documentation a little bit easier to construct.
Yeah, I think to your actual question, Jared, it's very hard to answer, right? Like, once we're there, once we're during that week, and like one thing that I've noticed is that we frequently end up with our deadlines being really hard deadlines, like there's a conference tomorrow and someone's demoing this on stage. And it's easy to say maybe we should just have a deadline that is more artificial. But we kind of did this time. Like we had a deadline that was 4 or 5 days before, and then we pushed it back and pushed it back as far as we could. But we tend to get to the point where it's just, realistically, like people felt like that documentation had to be done and that it was critical. And I think that if we had asked the question, can we not have this services guide or something like that, the answer probably would have been like, no, we need it. And then if we ask the question, can we write this services guide without staying up all night? The answer would have been like, no, there's not time. So I don't know what to do there once we are in that place.
I have some ideas for what might help with that. So I think that for those questions that you mentioned, Nick, of like, can we not write this? There isn't a clear answer, at least for me, in part because I don't feel like there's a clear understanding, maybe it's just for me personally, of who we're actually targeting for the early adopters specifically and what their specific needs are to help us prioritize things more aggressively and say, like, can we just not do this because like the users that we're targeting don't actually care about this, even though it's a useful thing in general. And then another thing that could help. So I think having those strong definitions and making sure we're, for me, I would need to like repeat them every week for a while until I remember them effectively and internalize them. But I think another thing that would help is if we had releases more often, so that we could say, well, if we do need to not do this now, at least we can get it in the next release in a couple weeks or something, so that the cost of not getting something into a release is not as high.
That's a really good point, Suskin, that, it's like a lot of this, requirement or desire to get something in at a certain deadline is because if you miss that, it's going to be a few months before you can get it out again. And if we had a more rapid, frequent release cadence cycle there, that the consequences of not getting something in would be much less drastic. Of okay, cool, well, we'll wait a couple weeks. Like that's a pretty strong point.
Yeah. Thanks.
So what in that scenario drives the urgency, right? Like normally when you have a clear definition of who you're targeting and you're engaged with that target customer or Crossplane community member, that creates the sense of urgency, right? Someone is expecting you to engage, right, and help them solve a problem. Do we think that basically as we get better with community engagement and sort of building these scenarios that will just naturally improve?
I feel that once we have more people using it, that'll naturally improve. My understanding of what is driving the urgency is that it's mostly we have a conference coming up. We know that the people that could potentially want to use Crossplane could gain awareness of it at this conference. So we want to have something newsworthy to announce at the conference. So, yeah.
So was there a point in there, I think that, which I think I would agree with, but I'm not sure if I just made this up in my head, but that basically as we get more engagement, the cruciality of having like hundreds of demo at every conference will go down.
Yes, and I think the other part of it is as we get more engagement and we know who our users are and what they actually want, we'll be able to say, when new ideas come up or new asks come in, we'll be able to say, well, we don't actually need this for what we're trying to do right now with our current users, so we'll move this lower in priority. It felt like the standard approach was, well, I guess we'll fit it in because that does seem important. What are your thoughts?
But for what it's worth, my sense is that there's still a balancing act between sort of the broad architectural fundamentals like networking and security and things versus like engaging specific potential users or adopters of Crossplane on, whether it's Concourse or others, like, and how you balance that, because there's a set of features that, are still missing from Crossplane that will allow folks to, like Nick was saying, move things into production, right? And not just, get engaged and then fall off, right? They'll actually see that there's something, a kernel of something that they could run in production, or they can see a path to running it in production. And I'm curious what people feel about where we're at with respect to that.
Part of the thing that's come up around that, Steve, in the last couple of days, when we first started talking about driving adoption in the context of 1.4, one of the very first sort of theories was like, would we have more adoption if, we could conceivably be like, for a very small subset of functionality, like you just use Terraform today to deploy your databases or something and nothing else. Could you move to Crossplane? And one of the things that we've been questioning, and I don't know if we have a solid answer on yet, is do we really feel like people are trying to use Crossplane and then being like, oh, this isn't stable enough, and then moving away, or is it just that they're not trying in the first place? Because I suspect that if people were like, I am trying this and it's overwhelming me, we might be getting slightly more bugs and things like that, being like, I tried this and it sucked. Like there might be more signals that that's happening.
I see. So we're even earlier in the funnel where things like the documentation, the engagement are problematic versus like, hey, I need this list of core features before I can meaningfully engage. You're not seeing that.
I'm not talking about from the actual user's perspective, but as a new hire, for me, who has some background in what we're doing, the whole Go thing, and then looking at having access to other folks here, it took me like 2 weeks to understand, to have like AWS stuff working, because there was a fundamental bug in it, which was buried there for a long time and no one knew about it. So I'm definitely saying if someone wants to try it, they definitely have that problem of like, oh, things are not working. Maybe you just should move on. So, yeah.
But would you guess that people are maybe hitting that scenario that you saw and are just not letting us know? They're downloading it, running it, finding a fundamental bug and being like, I'm just going to move on and I'm not going to go on Slack and ask about it. I'm not going to raise an issue. Just going to give up because this is too bad for me to engage.
I don't know the answer to that. My gut feeling is like, yes, why not? But I'm just saying, even if like people were trying to use it, they definitely are coming up with bugs and it's not like it's working, to the point that we need to work on examples and things rather than having features, I guess. But I don't know the answer to your question.
Yeah, the statement that you made there about like, this is my SRE hat being on, but about the sort of chasing features, like that's something that I have struggled with a lot. Like it feels like we're frequently prioritizing shiny new stuff to demo and the new features that we think will bring people. I don't necessarily believe that that's the wrong thing to do anymore, but it definitely takes more priority over actually shoring up.
To be clear, I'm not saying those are necessarily two different things. I'm just saying when it comes to prioritizing, it's important that we have something basically usable by people. And then when that's definitely the case, we can keep adding new features, shiny features to it. I'm not necessarily saying we should just stop adding new features. I'm just saying we should definitely make that usable.
And part of my question is that different users are going to have different requirements for what is usable for them. Even for the idea of we want this to be production ready, we want people to be able to use it in production. Different users are going to have different definitions of what constitutes production ready. Maybe they'll say we only need one feature, but we need it to be super good. Or maybe they'll say we need 10 features, but they don't need to be that good yet.
I actually thought about it. I think the way that makes more sense, at least this has been the case for me for all the open source, most of the open source projects I've seen online and try them out. Usually there is a very simple and then straightforward example that kind of like clicks in your mind, this is what Crossplane does. And then you yourself as the user relate that to what you want to achieve, and then go dig more to see how can you actually use that concept in your own case. To your point, I think that's true, but also I'm still thinking we're away from having that basic concept, like set in the user's brain. This is what it is. This is how you use it. And if you want to like apply it to your thing, maybe now you want to like do a Slack conversation or like raise an issue or stuff like that.
So Daniel, there was something that you this is looping back a little bit to a while ago. If I recall, you were sort of asking, or you were suggesting that on the topic of how could we cut scope at the last minute, having a better understanding of who our users were and what we were doing for that release would help with making those decisions. And I was so then I was like, all right, who were our users and did we know that going into 0.3? And I would say that we had, maybe this was lost in translation somewhere, but we had identified that what we were trying to do for 0.3 was address the feedback that we'd got from one of our very few potential users who've actually tried to use Crossplane, which was GitLab, that they didn't want to go and create all those networking primitives by hand. And that we also, the other class of users that we were trying to go after were people who might write stacks, which is pretty broad, but we wanted to enable those. So thinking back on it, I feel like we did kind of identify the users that we wanted to engage with. And maybe we lost track of that or something, because you could argue that maybe like having great guide for how to use stacks or something like that was not a priority given that we were chasing those two things. Not sure.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, I think GitLab is a good example of this. Like, it would probably much better if we had like some other companies or products that we actively engage with and like, invest on, like, get some investment from their side, like into using Crossplane. But it might be a little bit harder at this stage.
I think a lot of the kind of idea for the documentation for 0.3 was also, like, let's have a stacks guide so that after this releases, we can go out and it's like less like we need to be like, we don't want to be told that we need a stacks guide, right? We want to go out to potential partners and already be able to point to it and say, hey, come join us. You can build a stack now. And we've already written up how to tell you how. There's no lag time.
Just on the GitLab topic and the engagement with partners, to set context, going into 0.4, it's still top of mind. We both want to be having GitLab deploy Crossplane as part of their stack, or rather, as not their literal Crossplane stack, deploy Crossplane as part of Auto DevOps. And part of that feeds into the let's be more stable, because we're concerned that GitLab isn't going to want to ship alpha software. And we also still want GitLab to be recommending people use Crossplane to spin up their databases and whatnot to actually deploy GitLab itself instead of Helm chart. One thing that makes that difficult is that there is a huge diff in complexity between you can deploy WordPress with a stack and you can deploy GitLab with a stack. So, but that's going to be a focus, I think, likely in 0.4.
All right. Let's... Unless anyone wants to extend that, it does feel like we've been wanting to move into the faster release cadence.
It also it felt like it turned into questions about users and prioritization.
Yeah.
Which could be a signal that we should be talking about that.
Right. Do you want to quick show of hands, should we switch over to faster release cadence, or do you feel like there's more to unearth about the users and the focus?
Do we have any action items from that discussion?
I couldn't quite capture any. I'd be happy to see it.
I feel like something to Daniel's point about I feel like at the start of a release, we have a pretty good idea of what we're doing. It's some way of like, obviously we don't sit in an office together, but a big poster on the wall that says, what are we trying to do with this release? To just that we could point to every time we're making decisions and be like, that's what we're trying to do. That's the goal. I don't know if that would be useful in some way.
It's I would hope the roadmap could do that, Nick. Like that, the roadmap should, if it's not serving that point, then it should serve that point.
This could just be me. I never look at the roadmap, and maybe that's just I need to look at the roadmap more. But like during my day, I'm not.
Should we print it out and like mail it to you to post on your wall?
Well, something like that. But like realistically, like the roadmap is a document in GitHub. Like how many of us have looked at the roadmap during the 0.3 development?
I also never looked at it.
I think it seems like if the roadmap is a living thing that's reflected in the epics that the team, is building each sprint plan off of. If that, and that's where we would typically see these things on a weekly basis. So if we feel like the epic sort of drifted from what was important for the release, then that might be a bigger challenge to address.
I don't think they did really at all, because the epics were exactly one-to-one marrying the items in the roadmap, and that remained that way until the end of the release.
Well, I will point out that what Nick was describing as the initial goal of the release, which was, I think, address GitLab feedback and help people build stacks. I think he said GitLab people especially, was definitely contrasted with what I was hearing the last couple of weeks. Maybe this was a different context, but I definitely heard statements like the stacks guide is the critical piece, or the WordPress stack with the stacks guide is the star, which I'm not sure completely fits with what Nick was describing.
And it could be that I just don't remember correctly what it was, but I think that kind of speaks to it, like that we could be doing something better to just I'm not disagreeing. I'm not suggesting that the epics drifted or anything like that. I am suggesting that we could probably do something better to remember as we go what the priorities are. And maybe it's as easy as we just have quicker releases, because then you don't have 8 weeks to forget what you planned 8 weeks ago.
Right. And then we would be revisiting the outcomes and objectives more frequently, right? Like the actual mechanics and implementation details, it's easy to kind of get lost in those and forget that at the end of the day, we're trying to get this into the hands of GitLab or whatnot.
What if I have an idea for an action item. What if we included looking at the roadmap as part of the sprint, either close or opening ceremonies?
Yeah, and I remember Phil brought it up on his screen like almost every time that we were talking about like sprint planning or like looking at the epics. Like the roadmap came up a fair amount of times, so I'm kind of a little surprised that folks don't remember.
I want to second what Jared's saying, because I feel like the roadmap was very, like, we had that big powwow. Everybody was in the room. Like, we shifted a few times on what our focus would be during that. And that ultimately became the roadmap items. And those roadmap items for 03 and then the following ones for 04 and sort of the rough ones for 05, they do seem to make sense. And they were based on that user input. And I feel like even the tail end of work that we were doing were smaller bullets on those 03 items and 04 items. Like, documentation was in there. It's just that we didn't get to it till the end. I feel like what we produced was influenced entirely by that.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So this does feel like a good cut into a faster release cadence, and let's kind of keep exploring this. Like, how do
I have a stop at 12:30 that I'll have to break out for.
Okay, actually we are out of time then.
It seems like we could capture an item, though. It seems like I don't think anyone disagrees with the idea of a faster release cadence, though. So in the last seconds of this retro, can we just say that we want to try and release something in like 2 weeks? Or
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
So did you say weeks, or should we just call it a monthly?
No strong opinion, but I'm curious to hear what Mavavik was thinking.
Yeah, so one thing that is like, I mean, a little bit of problem with faster release cadence is that, we don't have an upgrade path. So like if we have like from 0.3 to 0.4, like 5 versions in between, and like all different, CR fields and stuff, the public interface changes. So it would be hard to, tolerate all of them, or like just not tolerating all of them, like, migration paths and like, compatibility. Like right now we just don't do it, but like more releases, I think will put some pressure on that. Like a lot of people with different versions around, and like just more versions to make compatible, to be compatible with.
Okay, and then to capture the goal on how frequently what's the ideal release?
Yeah, and
cadence?
I don't think we're going to decide that right here. I think the action item here is that, like, in our planning for 0.4, that we should have an item early in the milestone of exploring the release cadence, release process, and potentially make it much more rapid. Like that should be a short-term thing, which it already is, that we've already discussed that and have that as a desire, but we haven't finished planning yet.
Okay.
Is there a way we can assign, Dan made a good point that we don't have owners for these actions. Can we assign them async maybe in Slack or something after this meeting?
Sure.
Do we want to run through it like right quick and see if there's any of the obvious ones to put owners on?
Sure, if we've got time.
Yeah, like the release process, or like that, I'd be happy to take that one. The capture release process document, like 5 down from the top, and then an action item to develop a more rapid release process. Like I'd be happy to drive that, or at least get that as a planning item, or an item in our planning. That's fine. That's good too. I'm happy to do that too.
I'd be happy to drive some of the dog fooding efforts if we wanted to have like some ideas or discussion around that. I'd be happy to set up some sort of meetings that could potentially include not just Crossplane specific members.
And I think having that in the planning, like a 0.4 item that like we assign, and have someone drive like that is a great way to do that. And if you have interest and excitement about that, Dan, then that's even better. That maybe land on you.
The start using PR template, I believe the motivation for that was for including documentation in the definition of done. And that's similar to something that we were talking about in the Stacks SIG retro, which I am the assigned person for, so I can take this one as well.
Yeah, good call, Sis.
I had a thought around that as a suggestion of how it can be done. I don't typically like action items that are remember to do that thing that we haven't been doing. So maybe one thing that we could add to it would be a checklist for reviewers, as in a guide to doing pull request review to remind the people not to approve things unless they have documentation.
Nice. Yeah, I like that idea.
You wanted an action item for that?
Not really, just kind of.
Okay.
I'll make a note of it.
Manual for that.
I'll make a note. Thanks, Nick.
Any others here that folks want to?
I could take the video. We could take the video one, and I could take making a crazy zany stack. But I think that my thought there was that it would be more interesting if it was a diversification. If everybody started making purpose fit stacks.
Yeah.
And sorry, what was the second one, Marcus?
The one beneath it. But I don't know if that's something that a single person should take. Maybe that's something where we like just come up with some crazy ideas.
Seems like you're already active, so distributing this is a good thing.
One way that we could encourage more people to do that would be to build in more time for hack weeks and things like that. I think I personally feel like, I love that idea, but if you're like, Nick, you've got barely any time to get your actual work done before the next release, can you also go and build a fun, zany stack? I'm going to say, no, it's more important to rewrite the GKE cluster support or whatever. But if it was like, we're going to take another 2 days or something like that, and this is the time that you're encouraged to work on things like that, then that would help a lot to
So Steve, I made you the host, so when I drop off now, I will not close. I should not close this meeting.
Okay, thanks.
So thank you everybody for participating in this discussion here. I think this is really fruitful.
Yeah, thanks.
Great. Bye, Jared. Anyone else on these?
I can. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Move off it.
I would like to take on something, but like I don't know, some of the action items seems vague. Like maybe I can take on the upgrade path to investigate like how we would do it.
Yeah, that would be sweet.
Maybe open an issue about it.
I'll take the hack weeks one. I've got something sort of bouncing around in my mind. I don't know if it's so much about taking a hack week, but there's potentially some overlap with, like this week, for example, we finished 0.3 and we're still scrambling to plan 0.4. So I think that's an ideal time to kind of do what we've done and be like, talk amongst yourselves, but it could be maybe more targeted to be like everyone go write a stack or something like that during the hack week. Or hack days.
Okay.
I can take the right documentation early on. One, if no one else wants it, I'd probably start with writing a proposal for. Well, it'd probably be related to the definition of done and related to how we sequence the type of work that we're doing.
Oh, Dan, if you're doing that, I would suggest take a look at the other issue that I opened in the documentation column. I left a few notes in there, and we kind of like talked about that too.
Oh, yeah.
That will be relevant.
Okay, cool.
Cool. Okay. Well, I think we can leave it there unless anyone else has concluding remarks.
No, thank you for facilitating the sprint, Steve. I mean the retro, rather.
Great. Thanks for having me. All right. Thanks, guys. Talk to you later.
Well, thanks, everyone.
Thank you.